What's up, Nintendo gamers? This is Nintendo Guy 1981. Welcome to the top 5 for November. Now, 2 months ago, you guys saw the worst selling consoles Nintendo ever made. But now, it's time to see the best selling systems that they have made. And I bet you guys know what number 2 and 1 are. But let's get directly to the top 5. Number 5, the gray box that saved the video game industry, also known as the NES. The NES was a great console released in 1985, and it sold the game, and it saved the game industry, and it didn't sell it. That'd be bad. But the NES clearly saved the video game industry from, crashing entirely. If it weren't for the NES, the Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo's later consoles probably wouldn't have even been here, so we have to thank this thing. It sold about 61.91 million units, so that's pretty impressive. So, you guys, but there are obviously better selling consoles that Nintendo has made, and they are all on this list. Number 4, the Game Boy Advance. Now, this one was a great console, but there were many different versions of it. I'm sorry for the glare. But there were many different versions of this system, and it was still pretty awesome, but not as awesome as its predecessor. So, the Game Boy Advance came out in 2001, and it was basically the successor to the Game Boy, like the real successor. And overall, it just turned out really great. It was just a powerful handheld system with a color screen, backlit screen as well. No real gimmicks, and this was before Nintendo started making gimmicks with all their consoles. It was just really good. It had a bunch of good games. But I find one thing sort of meh about the Game Boy Advance. I feel that a lot of the games were just remakes of older games from older consoles. I don't know, that's just my thought because I've seen a lot of YouTubers play remade games on their Game Boy Advances. And the reason that the Game Boy Advance probably sold so well was a different model of it, the SP. The SP was basically just a fold-up console, like a DS, but way smaller. So it was easier to take with you as well. The Game Boy Advance is 14 years old now, and its legacy will live on. It sold about 81.51 million units, so that's pretty awesome. Number 3, the Wii. The Wii sold so well because of how revolutionary it was. It introduced Virtual Console. It sort of brought back backward compatibility because the DS already had it with Game Boy Advance games, but they basically just redefined the meaning of backward compatibility. This thing introduced Virtual Console, which was awesome. You could just play classic games from NES, Super NES, and Nintendo 64, but I don't need any N64 games on this, because I have one. But if you don't have an NES or a Super NES or a Nintendo 64, and you still want to play those games, well, some of those classic games, just buy the Wii. Or you can buy a Wii U with, the DS Virtual Console and everything, but let's not talk about that right now, because honestly, the Wii is better. Even though it's been discontinued and it's a 7th gen console, it was just so revolutionary. I mean, also the invention of wireless controllers and motion controls was just good for Nintendo. It just gave them 80s memories when they were just demolishing Sega and Atari. So, the Wii was just awesome. And that's why it sold so well. It didn't sell as much as the Game Boy or the DS, though, but it still sold better than the Game Boy Advance and the NES. 101.15 million units. It also outsold the Xbox 360 and the PS3 as well. Number 2, the original Game Boy. Once again, sorry for the glare on like all the images. This system was developed by Gunpei Yokoi, who was a famous Nintendo engineer, and he developed the Game Boy, the D-pad, the Game & Watch games, as well as the Virtual Boy. Well, the Game Boy came out in 1989, as we all know. Sure, it had like a spinach-colored screen, and there was like no backlight, but the games were phenomenal, and that's why the Game Boy sold so well then compared to Sega's Game Gear or Atari's Lynx console. It's just your average handheld system. I mean, there's really not much else to say about it. Now, there's another reason why it sold so well. The game that was packaged with it, Tetris. It's a famous puzzle game, and there's been many ports of it on other consoles, but let's face it, the Game Boy version is the best. Even though it may not be in color, but the Game Boy version's still the best. It's just the oldest one, and it just gives people the memories of the 80s. The Game Boy sold about 118.69 million units, which is awesome. You would think that the Game Boy would be the best-selling Nintendo console of all time, but there's a console that Nintendo released that actually defeated the Game Boy sales. You guys will find out in the next scene. And now, the number 1 best-selling Nintendo console of 2014 is the Nintendo DS. Yes, the DS defeated the Game Boy. Now, the original DS was not that great. It wasn't very durable. The top was sort of flimsy. And it just, I don't know, not many people liked the DS. The graphics were okay, and it still had some good games, but not many people liked the original DS. Then came the DS Lite. It was smaller, more durable, better, and it had better sound, better graphics, and a better screen than the original. Then came the DSi and the DSi XL. Those DSs had cameras on them, and you could just do a whole lot more with the DSi and the DSi XL than you could with the original DS and the DS Lite. So the reason that the DS sold so well was because of the other models, sort of like the Game Boy Advance. The original DS came out in 2004, the DS Lite came out in 2006 or 2007, the DSi came out in 2009, and the DSi XL came out in 2010, sort of at the end of the DS's life. So, the DS just sold so well because it had many different models which were better than the original. And overall, it just had good games, and also, it had smaller game cards and introduced game cards, even though the TurboGrafx 16 had them. But it introduced them, and it had a stylus pen, and yeah, just the stylus pen, and it was just powerful. It had so many good games, but the number one reason it sold so well were because of its other models, I think, because it just made the DS better, especially with the DSi when it came out with its cameras and the DSi shop and everything. The DSi is the reason the DS family of systems is the number 1 best-selling Nintendo console of all time. 153.99 million units, which can just simply be rounded to 154 million. But the DS family of systems, it's not the best-selling console of all time. It's the best-selling Nintendo console of all time. But the best-selling console of like all time is the PS2. The DS is not too far behind the PS2. So if enough people buy the DS in a few more years, maybe the DS can beat the PS2 in the future. If that happens, I will go crazy, and Nintendo will be just my favorite company for as long as I live. So, there's the reason the DS is such a good system. It's powerful, and it introduced stylus pen and game cards and stuff. It also just had many different models that just made it better. Channel of the day is Danger Dolan Gaming. He does top 5s and 10s like this as well. And another thing, the DS is probably the reason Nintendo is still here today. If it weren't for the DS and the Wii, Nintendo could have ended up like Sega. So, thank God the DS did so well. And I'll see you guys tomorrow for some Let's Predict and a vlog.